Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Dan and Joe Sports Show. As always, I'm Dan.
And I'm Joe.
All right, Joe, this is like kind of our little sneak peek into the SEC Media Days. We're going to do a more in-depth SEC Media Days show next week at the conclusion of it. But from listening to the interview of Lane Kiffin and the questions that were asked of him, I just wanted to have a quick segment that talked about what I'm sure is a very tiresome thing for Lane Kiffin and something that he mentioned, but that if anything, he undersold, which is surprising from Lane Kiffin, but he did. And that's just how much he has to talk about Alabama all the time, even though he hasn't coached there in over 4 years. He doesn't coach there currently. He really has very little to do with them except for one time a year that he plays them. And yet I listened to this interview and 80% of the questions that he had were either Nick Saban or Alabama. And I would be so incredibly frustrated if I was him.
Yeah, I didn't hear yet the full interview segment. I still want to go back and do that. But just at the beginning, I remember I heard one or two questions, and most notably people asking him about like being glad maybe this year that Alabama was further along on the schedule and not, as early in the season. And, he was pretty diplomatic with his answer. He just said something like, I don't even look that far ahead. I just know who we're playing like week one. But, you could definitely tell that, any rational person like you kind of alluded to would not want to continue to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like they're playing in the first game of the season. I would give some journalists a little bit of a pass if they were talking about, hey, are you looking forward to that Alabama game week one? Okay, that could be a reasonable question. But you're sitting here, he's coming off one of the best regular seasons that Ole Miss football has had pretty much since the Johnny Vaught era. And you're coming off also what's going to be a really compelling quarterback matchup, which, I mean, in my mind, that's the most interesting thing coming out is, of course, you have the return of Luke Altmaier coming off what was a little bit of an erratic performance against a very good Baylor defense where he showed a little bit of promise, but let's be honest, didn't have a great game. And then Jackson Dart coming in, who everybody thought was going to be the man, really exciting USC transfer, comes with all the sunshine love that you get from a guy coming from Southern California. But then you can think about the Grove Bowl where it looked like Altmaier was way better. And so in my mind, that's a really compelling, topic to me. And so I would have thought that would have been the first question. But that did get brought up, but it wasn't until I heard Nick Saban like 20 times. And then suddenly that got buried in the middle of the interview.
Well, speaking of that, you also have the notable, originality of Ole Miss building this team mostly through the transfer portal. In the kind of new transfer portal era, they're one of the first teams that's just kind of inserted so many starters in 1 year, one off season that are all going to be new to the team. Like a lot of times, in years past, you would see teams bring in transfers, would have to sit out a year. But you've got so many, players, could be the quarterback. You're going to have Michael Trigg, a lot of players on defense, some other receivers that are all first-year newcomers to Ole Miss. And so, to me, one of the big storylines around this team is, will that model work? And if it works, will you see more teams follow suit? If it doesn't work, that's going to have implications as well. So, to me, that's one of the storylines for sure.
Oh, absolutely. That's a huge story. I mean, when you think about it right now, as it's slated, Ole Miss's 1 and 2 running backs, who right now are both rated as top 25 running backs, are both transfers. And then they also have Michael Trigg, from USC, who came over with Jackson Dart, who looked to be the better of the pickups between Dart and Trigg based on what I saw in the Grove Bowl. He looks to be the number one receiver coming in. And then, if for some reason Jackson Dart were to come in and be the starter, then that's 3 on the offensive side. And then when you go to the defensive side, I mean, they got Ladarius Tennyson from Auburn, who was a starter for most of the season last year and is a very solid safety from what has been a very strong, secondary for Auburn for about the last 5 or 6 years. And that's a guy who I'm sure is going to be a starter at Ole Miss. And I mean, you can go down the line from that, but that's, it's huge. It's going to be, if Ole Miss can have a very good football team this year, it's going to basically be like what happened at Michigan State last year.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's going to be definitely telling. And, I'm glad you brought up the running backs. I've heard some insiders say, just kind of listening to other shows, that this may be the most talented running back room that Ole Miss has had in the modern era. And, that's saying something. We look at what they had last year with Connor and with Ely. So we will see on that. But, with the USC front, to me, I've always been much more fascinated with Lane Kiffin's previous tenure at USC, honestly, than I ever was with anything with Alabama. And so to me, that would be a lot of good questions, especially, with USC using the transfer portal lately.
Yeah. And I think there was somebody did ask a question to Lane Kiffin, I believe, about what he would, how he would have managed the travel that USC is going to have to deal with joining the Big Ten and what kind of headache that would be. And he kind of had a dismissive answer about it, but he did comment about how terrible that's going to be for him, which of course it is going to be. And I think that's an interesting topic. And I also think too, it would have been interesting. And I think somebody should ask Mario Cristobal about this at ACC Media Days. Did he know something when he left Oregon that last past summer? Because I know that he was going back home to coach at Miami, but still Oregon was in a much better place than Miami was when he left. So it's, I wonder if maybe he got tipped off about this USC and UCLA move, and maybe that made his decision even more, because as it sits right now, Oregon's going to have to stay with the sinking ship.
Yeah, no, that's very possible. I would be fascinated to see, if he had kind of a tip on that.
Yeah. But yeah, just going back to it with Lane Kiffin, I just thought there was so many, interesting topics that could have been raised, from what happened last year, the Tennessee game, to, to maybe his decision-making at Auburn, if you want to talk about specific games. And then instead it was all Nick Saban and Alabama, and what has just become very tiresome with his interviews, and which he's got a lot of good things to say. So I just think the journalists need to step their game up a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you would think so.
Speaking of stepping your game up, when we come back, we're going to talk about all the Ole Miss and Auburn baseball players who got drafted in the Major League Baseball draft. Quite a haul for both programs this year, after both made it to the College World Series. And of course, the Rebs brought home their first baseball national championship. And then we're also going to look at some other notable players who got drafted, including the son of one of the former Braves greats, and maybe my favorite Braves player ever. And as always, I'm Dan.
And I'm Joe.